We all have disagreements within our family, be it over trivial things like what to watch on TV, or more serious issues like finances and partners. But when stubborn child Daniel Petric clashed with his parents over a copy of Halo 3, their battle would end in the most unthinkable of ways, leaving one dead and another fighting for their life. Daniel's story would not stop there either. Outrage aside, it was the next case to spark nationwide debate over the video game industry, and further question the notion of violence for entertainment. But who was Daniel Petric? What actions did he take against his parents? And what was the aftermath? Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, folks. My name is Adrian, and welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime. Today we're looking at the case of Daniel Petric. You know, I used to play a lot of video games while growing up. Things like Call of Duty, World of Warcraft, Battlefield, back when the series was good, and even GTA. To say that gaming was a large part of my life while growing up is quite an understatement. I made many friends who I still know today, learned a fair few things, and had a lot of fun. However, there is a very fine balance when it comes to video games, and that's a balance that parents have to decide for their own children. But who knew that it could end in murder? Before we begin, and just to let you know that I post true crime and strange cases here weekly, so if that does sound like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing to the channel, it really does help me out. And now, with that said, please grab yourself a coffee, pull up a seat, and get ready for the deep dive. This is the case of Daniel Petric. Well, Wellington, isn't it good to see you? Touch down in the city of Cleveland and head 30 miles southwest, and you'll find yourself traveling through the small town of Wellington, Ohio. With a meager population of 5,000 residents, Wellington is best described as a quiet town with plenty of charm. As you can likely imagine, not that much goes on here. Most of what Wellington has to offer includes the great outdoors. The town has a library, a middle school, a town hall, and this weird train thing, whatever it is. Not a lot for a young kid to do, as you can likely guess. And this is perhaps something to keep in mind while going through our case today. Anyway, it's here in the leafy neighborhoods of Wellington that we find the Petric family. Susan Petric, aged 43, and her husband Mark were the proud parents of their two daughters Heidi and Holly, and of course their son Daniel. The Petrics were a typical suburban family. Susan and Mark had been married for around 23 years. Focusing on Susan, she was born and raised in Cheverly, Maryland, and it was after attending Valley Forge Christian College in Pennsylvania that she met and fell in love with Mark. At the time that this story takes place, Susan was happily working in Weber's Healthcare, a nursing home found within Wellington. Whereas for Mark, he was a Pentecostal minister at the New Life Assembly of God. As a result, all three children were raised in a Christian household. They were all described as having a good relationship with their parents, and the family home was about as peaceful as a family of 5 could get. Focusing on our main character of the story today, Daniel Petric was a 16-year-old kid who fit the American standard. Born on August the 24th, 1991, he was 16 years old at the time this story took place. Growing up, his friends and family described him as a normal and happy teenager, fun to be around and friendly to talk to. To add to this, he also appeared to be very enthusiastic about the Bible in his younger teen years, and remained out of trouble while at school too. And although he may not have been the brightest crayon in the box, he certainly was not the most dull either, and was able to consistently achieve average to good school grades. Being a teenager growing up in a small American town, it is no surprise that Daniel found quite a large interest in video games. And unfortunately, after a spinal injury, this interest would continue to grow. After contracting a spinal injury during a skiing holiday, Daniel was housebound for more than an entire year. As a result, the TV became his best friend, and eventually the Xbox did too. But herein lies the problem, because although Mark didn't mind video games, he despised violent ones. And that's when Daniel started to take an interest. You see, at the time, in the year 2007, parents were not too sure what to think about violent video games. The realism was relatively new, and they didn't know how it would affect their children. Actually, even I faced this issue. I was 15 years old at the time, and my mum was not comfortable with the game GTA. In fact, it was banned in the family house, and so I snuck around a friend's house to play it instead. You know, at the time it really aggravated me, but I guess in hindsight I fully understand why she was uncomfortable. So I guess Mum, I'm sorry. Anyway, this was when Daniel and his friends all found an interest in Halo 3. And back in the Petric household, that's when tension began to grow. For those of you who don't know, Halo is a first-person shooter that puts you in the shoes of Master Chief, an enhanced super soldier that must fight aliens and parasites. Halo was massively popular back in the day, and still has a very loyal fanbase. It was the best-selling game of 2007, and even still today is considered to be one of the most influential FPS games of all time. So it's kind of obvious why a 16-year-old would love to play this game, and especially if all of his friends were playing it too. But Daniel's gaming habits remained unchecked, and he would play more than 8 hours of video games every single day. And when his father banned Halo 3 from the household, he would simply go over to his friend's house instead. And as you can likely imagine, as the consequences against Daniel increased, so did his reaction against them. Tensions really began to build in October 2007, and it all started when Daniel asked his father if he could buy him a copy of Halo 3. The answer was of course no, which provoked a tantrum from the teenager. Mark remanded that his son was to stop playing all violent video games. The man was very closely aligned with his Christian beliefs, and thought that these games were bad for Daniel's mind. He therefore gave his son an ultimatum: stop playing Halo 3 or move out of the house. Daniel, being the short-sighted teenager, picked the latter, moving in with a friend for several days as they played games for up to 18 hours a day. However, when his friend's parents grew concerned, they requested that Daniel moved back home. Naturally, this did nothing to fix the tension between father and son. Mark's boundaries remained very clear, but Daniel was ready to test them. After sneaking out of his bedroom window, Daniel travelled to his local GameStop to buy himself a copy of Halo 3. However, after bringing it home and sneakily trying to play it, his father caught him in the act. And as expected, a huge argument broke out between him and his parents. Confiscating it off of him, Mark placed the game inside the family safe, storing it next to his Taurus PT-92 handgun. Both of these things were inaccessible without the safe's key, which Mark kept in his own secret location. And with both objects strictly out of access for the troubled teenager, Mark hoped that the issue would settle down in the coming days. But unfortunately for him, and even more unfortunately for his wife, these hopes would be dashed in the most horrific of ways. October the 20th, 2007 started like any other weekend. It was a Saturday, and the Petric family were enjoying their time off. Their older daughter, Heidi, was expected to come home later that evening, where they would all watch baseball together. As the evening approached, Daniel walked into the family living room to talk to his parents. And with a tone of excitement in his voice, he asked them to close their eyes. "I have a surprise for you," he said. Mark and Susan were rather shocked by this. Daniel had spent the last few days in a very foul sulk. However, he now appeared to be positive and in an apparently giving mood. Curious to know what his surprise was, they both closed their eyes while remaining seated on the sofa. And with their eyes closed, Mark could hear Daniel walk behind him. With bated breath, he waited with anticipation as to what his son could be up to. But that was when he heard the all-too-familiar metallic click. In one of the most devious plots ever, Daniel had tricked his parents into lowering their guard. There was no surprise waiting for them, and now, with Mark's eyes closed, Daniel cocked the gun to the back of his head. In a feeble attempt to recover his game, Daniel had spent the last few days trying to find the key to the safe, and now that he'd opened it, he found the gun next to his copy of Halo 3. It was then, armed with his father's handgun, that Daniel stepped into the world of irreversible actions. He shot his father once in the head, before firing 4 rounds at his mother. The bullet to Mark's head had incredibly not killed him, but he was only a hair's breadth from death. As for his mother, she had unfortunately died, making Daniel a cold-blooded killer. It was at that moment that, out of sheer coincidence, Daniel's sister had just returned home with her husband, and after knocking on the front door, Heidi was greeted by Daniel. But something immediately seemed off about this. After asking if she could enter, he replied with, "You shouldn't come in. Mum and Dad had a big argument." Heidi could hear moaning in the background. It was her father trying to call out for help. That was when she pushed past Daniel, and while she realized the horror that had just unfolded, Daniel had rearmed himself with the handgun. Now, fortunately, his sister's husband thought very quickly and was able to pull the gun away from him. It was only now that, with the weapon wrenched out of his grasp, Daniel took the opportunity to flee. And of course, this was with his copy of Halo 3 in hand.
What's going on?
I don't know what happened. I just came over to my parents' house because we were going to watch the game, and my mom is shot, and my dad is shot, and my brother's here.
Does anybody know what happened? Did your brother shoot your parents?
I don't know. I think so.
Whatever the plan was, Daniel would never get the chance to play Halo 3 again, because shortly after fleeing with the family van, several police officers were able to locate, apprehend, and arrest Daniel easily. Life as a free person would come to an end for Daniel just after 7 p.m. But before going down, the young boy made one last effort to feign his innocence. And disgustingly, that would be by blaming his own father. While Daniel began his battle with the law, Susan's body was recovered by forensics while Mark was busy fighting for his life. Susan had been shot 3 times by Daniel, once in the chest and then the right arm, with a third and final shot to the head. She died almost immediately. As for his father, Mark, he was rushed to the nearest hospital where doctors did their very best to save his life. After feeling his head turn numb through a shattered jaw, Mark fell unconscious and slipped into a coma. In the meanwhile, the interrogation room was not a friendly place for Daniel. Both he and his story were heavily scrutinized under a fine lens. And the harder that officers pushed him, the closer he came to cracking. Hours into the interview, he finally gave up his story and confessed to his evil actions. Although the clip is not publicly available without copyright infringement, Daniel said the following to investigators. "I was sitting in my room, and then my dad was just yelling, just screaming at my mum. My dad walked into his bedroom and then walked back out. And then I heard a gunshot. I ran out there and my mum had been shot. He pointed the gun at me, and then he said he was sorry, and then he shot himself." Thankfully and miraculously, Mark would slowly recover from his critical injuries. However, this would only be after spending 2 weeks in a coma. However, doing so would come at the terrible cost of several realizations. Not only did he have to regain and relearn all of his bodily function, but he would also find out that his wife had been murdered. To add to this pain, Mark would never get full closure by attending his wife's funeral, which had been held during the 2 weeks that he was still in a coma. It was now, through his physical struggles, that an emotional struggle raged within. His very own son had shot him and killed his wife, and he'd have to work through these devastating feelings. As you can likely imagine, Mark received a lot of attention due to the unimaginably difficult predicament he found himself in. He even admitted that, after finding out what had happened, he initially hated his son, so much so that he internally debated killing him at the first opportunity he had. However, being a pastor, he said he turned to God to help him forgive his son as he recovered from his own wounds. During this time, he often reflected on one specific quote from the Bible: "Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do." And slowly, over time, Mark eventually forgave his son. Both of his sisters would eventually too. But in the meantime, and before Daniel's trial would commence, Mark had to recover. It turns out that Daniel's shot towards the back of Mark's head had actually entered through his cheekbone and deflected downwards, shattering his jaw but leaving his brain entirely intact. The bullet managed to avoid all contact with his brain and cervical spine, giving him a very strong chance at survival and recovery. However, this would not be without spending an entire month in hospital, and accounting for a total of 5 major surgeries. Mark required reconstruction to his eye socket, the roof of his mouth, and also his jaw. He was unable to speak for a very long while, would often shake, and was understandably left with a very strong case of post-traumatic stress disorder. However, slowly but surely, he regained his health and eventually his strength. Now, of course, there is a lot to talk about on how America as a nation responded to this case. Most of this centered around Halo 3 and Daniel's apparent thirst for violence. To be honest, it is very strange how the court responded to this case. We'll get to this debate in just a moment. Moving to the legal proceedings of this case, his trial was a surprisingly emotional one. Devoid of anger and blaming, Daniel seemed to show real accountability for his actions, while his family did their very best to show forgiveness. The prosecution disputed that Daniel did not show full remorse for his crimes, and therefore asked for the maximum sentence. However, Daniel's eyes were visibly red from crying throughout the entire trial, especially during statements read to and from his family. Addressing his father, he said, "Dad, I miss Mum. I miss my mum. I don't understand why I did something so terrible." The defense also argued that, while he did take accountability, it was his parents that gave him the Xbox console, that he was at the mercy of Halo's violent influence, and that Daniel heavily and unnaturally relied on the console for entertainment due to his spinal injuries. It was also highlighted that he never showed any signs of aggression before the murders, and had even tried to reason with his parents by seeking guidance on Christian websites. However, the prosecution argued that this was a cold-blooded attempt to murder his parents, motivated by a deep anger after being banned from playing Halo 3. They further highlighted his malicious intent during the murders. Not only did he conduct them with trickery, but he tried to frame his dad too. It was revealed during the trial that, as he lay there dying, Daniel planted the gun into Mark's hand and said, "Hold on to the gun, Dad. Hold on to it." It was majorly accepted that Daniel had intended to kill his father, and that his life was unintentionally spared when his daughter arrived home early, therefore scuppering Daniel's plans. When it came to his father, Mark could have been the man to save or sink his son's life. As a man who loved his son, but also lost his wife, he faced the most difficult of decisions. He could either seek absolute justice for Susan, or salvage what he had left of his family. Mark responded in the most noble of ways. He would visit his son every week in the months leading up to his trial, listened to his thoughts and feelings, and then went with what he thought was true. Addressing the judge and the courtroom, Mark forgave his son with love and understanding. He said he believed that his son deserved a second chance, only after allowing the pain that runs deep to better him inside.
Danny has had to face and is now facing the very serious consequences of what he did on October 20th, 2007. I know, without any doubt, he has severe regret, remorse, and guilt over what he did to his mom and I that evening. I can't count the number of times he has told me that he is so sorry for what he did and he'll never be able to forgive himself. I can also count the number of times he has told me that he is so happy that I survived and is so glad to still be able to see me. He's told me that numerous times. I love you, Danny. I can't count the number of times that he said, "Dad, I miss Mom. I miss Mom." His pain runs very deep, and it should. I believe it should run deep. And if his pain did not run deep, I guarantee you I would not be standing here speaking on his behalf. I'd call him like I see him. And I would not stand here and talk on his behalf if his pain didn't run deep. I know it does. So I'm asking the court on Danny's behalf for a lenient sentence. Because Danny does have remorse and regret. And I believe God is a God of forgiveness and a God of second chances.
When it came to a verdict, there was no nasty surprise awaiting. Since he had waived his right to a jury trial, he was at the very mercy of one single judge. And that judge, named James Burge, would sentence him to life in prison, with a minimum of 23 years behind bars.
Therefore, it will be the judgment of law and sentence of the court. Count 1, aggravated murder, 20 years at the Lorraine Correctional Institute. Counts 2 and 3 are allied offenses of count 1 and are murder. Count 4, 10 years at the Lorraine Correctional Institute. Counts 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 appear to be allied offenses to count 4, and they are merged. Count 11, 5 years at the Lorraine Correctional Institute. Those sentences will run concurrently.
Daniel Petric was convicted of aggravated murder, attempted aggravated murder, and tampering with evidence. But lucky for him, due to his age, he could not be handed the death penalty. Now, the point I found most questionable is how the judge perceived video games and their apparent effect on the human mind. But I guess this was 2007, right? Violent video games were a very hot topic, and domestic access to these first-person shooters was still a relatively new thing. Nobody really knew what would happen to children who played it on a daily basis, so everyone assumed the worst. Nevertheless, it really is wild to see grown adults hypothesize that just because a 16-year-old shoots fictional aliens in a video game, that he could murder his parents and expect them to respawn the following day. It really does blow my mind. But anyway, here is the judge's own perspective, which hasn't aged well over the years.
I believe in the Halo 3, what it amounts to is a contest to see who can shoot the most aliens who attack. It's my firm belief that after a while, the same physiological responses occur in the ingestion of some drugs. I mean, I believe that an addiction to these games can do the same thing. The dopamine surge, the stimulation of the nucleus accumbens, the same as an addiction, such that when you stop, your brain won't stand for it. The other dangerous thing about these games, in my opinion, is that when these changes occur, they occur in an environment that is delusional. Because you can shoot these aliens, and they're there again the next day. You have to shoot them again. And I firmly believe that Daniel Petric had no idea at the time he hatched this plot that if he killed his parents, they would be dead forever. But I believe there's hope here. I believe that it will start here, and at some point when all is known about Daniel and what occurred here, we will be able to achieve a greater sense of justice.
Look, I could probably dive into this narrative on video games and violence for many hours on end, but I don't think I'm going to change any single or collective narrative. However, what I can say is that despite decades of research and scientific studies, there is still no evidence that connects video games to real-world violence. The debate tends to center around false positives, which are stories such as this one that are deemed to be statistically significant, when actually they're just one of chance. One other thing to consider is how many people actually play games. In the year 2022 alone, more than 3 billion people played video games. And despite the exponential growth in gaming, there is no related growth in child gamer murders. And speaking from personal experience, playing video games like Call of Duty since the age of 13, there was never any point in time that I thought killing someone in real life would mean they respawn the next day. Whether you support the idea or not, we can all agree that wanting to play Halo 3 had a monumental influence over the death of Susan Petric. However, blaming the video game specifically for inciting his violence is probably the wrong thing to do. Overarching behavioral issues and psychological conditions are much more likely to be at fault here. Daniel was a child under pressure with a year-long injury, and naturally born monster or not, he was in a very unhealthy frame of mind. Not even he understands why he thought shooting shooting his parents was anything but stupid and evil. But blaming a video game over a psychological condition, the heat of the moment, or simply misjudged parenting is very short-sighted. It is interesting that prosecutors weighed in so heavily on Halo 3. They even claimed that, quote, Daniel was for months training himself to shoot his parents. He was addicted to a particularly violent game which rendered him delusional. The judge also stated his firm belief that video games can trigger the same psychological responses as psychoactive drugs, saying, quote, such that when you stop, your brain won't stand for it. There is no scientific proof to these claims, and while I do agree with the sentence that he was given, it feels wrong for a judge to express these beliefs without any psychological background or data. Either way, 23 years behind bars as a minimum is a fitting sentence for coldly shooting his own mother. He will be 40 years old by the time he is eligible for parole, giving him just enough time to have a second chance at life after the terrible actions he had committed. Daniel has since been incarcerated at the Mansfield Correctional Institution, which is found 30 miles southwest of Wellington. He is currently 31 years old and may find freedom in 2030, should he eventually convince a panel of judges. Daniel has since been interviewed multiple times since his sentence. He often shares how he misses absolutely everything about being free. This includes the little things that he often took for granted, before of course losing them. Mark's mental road to recovery was much longer than his physical one. The trial had left him and his family with fresh memories of that awful evening, and despite its eventual conclusion, he still remained without a son and without a wife. There would be light at the end of the tunnel, however. It did take a few years, but he has since remarried to another woman, and although he has romantically been able to move on, he will always remember Susan with great fondness. Sue had always been a woman of both faith and health. After attending a Christian college and regularly attending church, both she and her husband ministered people wherever they went. Her care for others was evident right to the very end of her life. She worked at a nursing home while she also tried her best to raise her children, something that even Daniel admits she did very well. Sue loved many and was loved by many too. This is certain. However, in the end, her death would be at the hands of her very own son, all because of an angry decision in a very poor frame of mind. And who knew that all of this could happen from being banned from a video game? I can already tell that this video will bring up quite a lot of debate about gaming and violence. So, what do you think about Daniel Petric's case? Do you think that video games had any influence over his decisions? Or do you think it was something else? Please be kind to each other in the comments, but otherwise I'm going to wrap this case up today, folks. Thank you so much for being here for another video today by Coffeehouse Crime. If you found this case interesting or insightful, please remember to like the video and subscribe if you haven't yet, it really does help me out. Otherwise, yeah, I think that pretty much wraps up this case today, folks. As always, I'll be back again very soon for another video. However, until that moment arrives, remember to look after yourself, look after each other, and of course, stay safe. Thank you, and goodbye.